The evening settled over the plains like a tired prayer, soft and slow, tinting the world in a weary gold that clung to the rooftops of Dustmere as if afraid to let go. Elora Mayfield stood outside her father's cabin, the boards beneath her feet warm from a day that never quite cooled, and watched the last thread of sunlight melt behind the far hills. She always lingered in this hour. It was the one moment the world felt gentle enough to hold. The air carried a quiet hum, the kind that belonged to crickets and far-off cattle, and the dreams of someone who still hoped life might one day shift toward kindness. She touched the doorframe, steadying herself, bracing for what she knew waited within. Silas Mayfield sat slumped at the table, his white hair hanging like trampled cotton, wiry and unwashed, the bottle beside him nearly empty. His hands, once steady, once capable of carving a horse saddle from a single piece of leather, trembled with the half-shivering hunger of a man too far gone to turn back. When he lifted his head, Elora saw a face carved by regret, by years of reaching for the easy burn of whiskey, instead of the harder work of love. She had learned long ago that kindness could not pry open a heart sealed by liquor. Still, she spoke softly, the way she always did. She asked if he had eaten, if he needed water, if he might consider resting. He answered with a grunt, one she had learned to interpret as dismissal. That was the first shift of the night, small and quiet, the tilt in the wind before a storm. She left the cabin with a sigh that felt older than her 21 years and walked toward town. Her steps were small, but her purpose firm. Jonas Pike's saloon would be busy now that dusk had settled. She hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Silas had not already traded his dignity for another drink. The street held its usual sounds. Boots on grit, laughter that had more bite than joy, the slow creak of shop signs nudged by the warm breeze. Dustmere was not a cruel place, but it was a place that knew exhaustion, a place where survival often elbowed compassion aside. Elora moved through it like a drop of spring water on sun-baked stone, unassuming, a reminder of softness in a land carved by hardship. Inside the saloon, lamplight flickered like restless fireflies trapped in glass. Jonas stood behind the bar polishing a mug that already shone, the way he always did when he wished he were somewhere else. Men filled the tables, their talk thick with smoke and pride. And there at the counter was Silas. The sight of him jolted her breath. He held out a desperate hand, palm open, shaking with a need that felt like a curse. Jonas's eyes flicked toward Elora with something like apology, something helpless. Silas ignored her entirely. Instead, he pointed to the bottle on the shelf as though it were salvation itself. But Jonas shook his head. Silas had no coin left to barter, no labor left to offer. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A tall figure rose from a shadowed corner of the room, a shape carved from the earth itself. Talon Stonewalker stepped into the light without hurry, shirtless despite the cooling evening, the muscles of his chest catching the lantern glow. He moved with the kind of calm that made other men straighten unconsciously, reminded that there were forms of strength beyond fists or firearms. His dark hair brushed his shoulders and his gaze, steady as river stone, settled not on Silas, not at first, but on Elora. A silent question flickered there. A measure. A weighing. And then he turned toward Silas, his footsteps measured, each one carrying the echo of distance traveled and battles weathered. Silas lifted his chin in brittle defiance, mistaking the attention for opportunity. He slurred out a few words, ugly, desperate words about needing just one more bottle, about having something worth trading after all. Elora felt the room tilt, felt the air slip thin, felt shame curl beneath her ribs like a frightened child seeking a corner to hide in. Jonas whispered a warning, voice tight. But Silas persisted, gesturing toward Elora with a hand that did not deserve to claim her. The saloon fell into a silence so deep it trembled. Even the piano player froze, hands hovering above the keys, as if the world had suddenly turned fragile. Talon stood as still as a carved sentinel, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low enough to feel before hearing, he said he would take the trade. Gasps scattered through the room like startled birds. Elora's breath shuddered in her chest, yet something in her stayed standing, stayed looking directly at him. Talon reached into the pouch at his side and set something on the counter, something that glinted faintly under the lamplight. It was enough. Jonas gave Silas the bottle with a look heavy with disappointment. Silas did not look at his daughter. He looked only at the drink, clutching it like the last thread of a frayed life. Elora could not move at first. Her legs felt like carved stone left out in the sun too long. Talon didn't touch her. He simply nodded once, a gesture neither commanding nor impatient, just steady. When he spoke, it was to her, not about her. His voice carried no claim, no ownership, only a quiet certainty that felt strangely protective. "Get your things and come with me." It was not a demand. It was an opening. A choice wrapped in the smallest mercy. That was the second shift of the night, a ripple threading through the air, something about to break and something about to begin. She walked out of the saloon without looking back. Though her heart ached with the weight of a farewell, she never truly had the chance to speak. The dust of the street clung to her boots as she made her way home one last time, gathered her belongings. A small bundle of clothes, a book with water-stained pages, a comb missing 2 teeth. When she stepped outside, Talon waited beneath the fading sky, the last strands of daylight painting his silhouette in copper. He did not ask what she carried. He only gestured to the road stretching beyond town. They walked together, though not close enough to touch. The silence between them was vast, yet gentle, like a river still deciding what shape it wished to take. Behind her, Dustmere shrank with each step, the saloon lights dimming until they faded entirely. Ahead lay only open land, warm evening wind, and a man whose eyes held storms and solace in equal measure. Elora felt her chest tighten with the strange realization that nothing in her life would ever return to what it had been before this moment. But it was the sound she heard behind them, a sudden shout, a bottle shattering, a voice slurred with rage, that made her turn her head, heart kicking against her ribs as if warning her that something had already awakened in the dark. The road stretched before them like a ribbon of fading gold, its edges softened by drifting dust and the tender hush of night settling low upon the land. Elora walked a step behind Talon at first, her bundle clutched to her chest, as though even the wind might try to take it from her. The sky above darkened slowly, and stars began to reveal themselves one by one, shy but certain, like tiny truths returning to a world that often forgot them. Each step carried her farther from Dustmere, farther from the life she had endured, farther from the man who had traded her for a bottle without blinking. Yet with every footfall, she felt something loosening too, like the cord wrapped around her heart was finally beginning to fray. Talon did not speak. His silence was not sharp the way some men's silence could be. It held space, not pressure. It told her she had room to breathe. He walked with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to long journeys, shoulders loose, breath calm, head tipped slightly toward the wind as though listening for the whispers of the earth beneath them. She watched the way his feet pressed into the dirt, each step confident but gentle, as if he respected even the ground that carried him. She had never seen a man move like that. After a time she found herself walking beside him instead of behind, not quite intentionally, guided more by instinct than decision. The land around them rustled with night creatures rising, field mice skittering through dry stalks, nighthawks soaring in low arcs, coyotes calling to one another from distant ridges. The world felt wider now that she was no longer trapped inside her father's orbit of sorrow. Talon glanced at her only once during that long stretch of quiet, his gaze steady, unreadable, but softened by something that did not feel like pity. She held his look for a moment before dropping her eyes, a flush touching her cheeks, surprised by how seen she felt beneath that brief and wordless exchange. When they reached a small clearing tucked between cottonwoods, Talon stopped. He placed his hand on the rough bark of one of the trees, not touching her, not turning fully toward her until she had come to a halt a few paces away. He said they would rest there for the night. No instructions, no orders. Only a calm statement, offered without expectation. Elora lowered her bundle, and let the evening settle around her like a blanket of warm uncertainty. Talon gathered dry branches with movements so fluid, they seemed almost ceremonial. When he struck flint to kindling, the fire rose slow and steady, casting a flickering amber glow across his features. In the shifting light, Elora saw the quiet strength in the lines of his face, the scars small and pale near his temple, the firmness of his jaw, the deep-set eyes that looked older than his 31 years. Yet there was gentleness there too, tucked just beneath the surface like a seed waiting for rain. She sat across from him, knees drawn close, hands folded in her lap. The warmth of the fire soothed the ache in her chest, though her mind kept drifting back to Dustmere, to her father's glassy eyes, to the bottle caught in his shaking grip. Shame rose in waves, hot and hollow, but Talon's presence anchored her, preventing the old grief from swallowing her whole. After a long silence, he slid his blanket across the ground toward her, stopping just short of her knee. She looked at it, then at him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The gesture said more than any set of words could have managed. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, the scent of smoke and pine filling her lungs with something close to comfort. The fire cracked, sending sparks upward like tiny fireflies escaping. Elora watched them until her eyes felt heavy. She asked softly why he had agreed to the trade. Her voice trembled on the question, unsure if she had the right to ask, unsure if she truly wanted the answer. Talon kept his gaze on the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his words were few, but they carried weight. He said he had seen enough of the world to know when someone needed saving. He said no one deserved to be bartered like an object. And he said that whatever Silas believed he was doing, it was no longer her burden to carry. Elora felt something unspool inside her then. Some knot of self-blame she had carried for far too long. She didn't respond. Her throat was too tight. But she met his eyes across the flames, and in that brief connection she felt her spirit shift, as if a door she had never dared to open had unlatched itself from within. Later, when the fire dwindled to a soft glow, Talon lay down a good distance away, positioning himself where he could see both her and the path leading back toward town. His body curled slightly to one side, one hand resting near the hatchet strapped to his belt. It was a protective stance, not a threatening one, and she knew, without knowing how, that he would not sleep deeply so long as she remained awake. The night stretched slowly. Elora rested her head against her bundle, the blanket wrapped tight around her, and listened to the rhythm of crickets weaving through the dark. She drifted in and out of thoughts, memories of childhood laughter long lost, of the years spent trying to lift a man drowning in his own grief, of promises broken and dreams deferred. And beneath those memories lay something unfamiliar yet warm, like the first blush of dawn across a cold horizon. It frightened her in a quiet way, the tenderness blooming in her chest at the mere presence of a man who had shown her nothing but dignity. Sometime after midnight, she stirred from a light doze and found Talon sitting upright, gaze fixed toward the path they had traveled. His posture was alert, tension humming through his broad shoulders. Elora sat up, heart quickening, and asked what he heard. He held up a hand, listening harder. A faint sound drifted through the stillness, a clatter, a distant curse, the unmistakable breaking of glass carried on the breeze. Silas! Or someone linked to him. Or someone who had witnessed the trade and intended to twist it into trouble. Talon rose slowly, each movement deliberate, his silhouette tall against the faint moonrise. He told her not to fear, but there was something in his voice, a sharpened edge beneath the calm, that made her breath catch. He stepped closer to her then, not touching her, but standing between her and the path as though his body alone could hold back whatever shadows approached. Elora stared past his shoulder into the dark. The night felt suddenly thinner, the trees less sheltering, the cicadas' chorus more strained. She realized then that the world she had stepped into, this road toward the unknown, was wider than she imagined, and not all dangers were behind her. As the noise drifted closer, her fingers tightened around the blanket Talon had given her, the warmth of it anchoring her trembling hands. And in that moment the truth settled over her like a cold gust across warm embers. The past she thought she had escaped was already on the road behind them, and it was coming fast. Morning rose gently, as though careful not to disturb the fragile quiet that had settled over the clearing. Pale sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, and Elora woke to the sound of wings beating softly overhead. For a moment, she lay still, watching dust motes drift in slow circles above her, feeling the weight of Talon's blanket across her shoulders. The memory of last night's distant shouts stirred uneasily in her chest, yet the world around her now seemed too calm to hold danger. Talon stood a short distance away, framed by the rising sun, his gaze searching the horizon with a vigilance that had become the shape of safety to her. He noticed her movement but did not turn fully, only tipped his head slightly as if acknowledging her presence without intruding upon the thin, tender boundary of her morning thoughts. She rose quietly, smoothing her hair, feeling the cool air kiss the warmth of her skin. Something inside her shifted in that moment, subtle but sure, as though the girl who had left Dustmere was not the same woman waking here beneath the open sky. The fear remained, yes, faint as a bruise not yet faded, but a new steadiness fluttered beneath it, delicate but determined. Talon handed her a small piece of dried meat, and a cup carved from gourd holding water gathered from a nearby creek. His actions were simple, wordless gestures of care, but they touched her more deeply than any spoken promise could have. She thanked him in a voice soft as early morning wind. He nodded once, and they began walking again, the path stretching out like an unwritten story before them. As the land widened around them, mesas rising in the distance like ancient guardians, Elora found her steps growing more assured. The rhythm of travel soothed her, the crunch of earth beneath her boots, the steady pace of Talon's stride beside her, the scent of sagebrush rising with the warming day. She caught herself studying the way the sun caught the lines of his shoulders, the way his hair stirred in the breeze, the way strength seemed woven into him without ever turning harsh. She wondered what it might feel like to walk beside someone not because she had been traded, but because she chose to. They reached the Apache settlement by afternoon. A cluster of dwellings rose from the earth as if grown rather than built, each shaped with care, each blending into the dusty palette of the land. Children ran barefoot through the open space, their laughter threading through the air like bright strands of music. Women paused in their work, grinding maize, weaving baskets, and looked toward Talon with respect that spoke of long-earned trust. Elora felt her breath catch, not from fear but from the startling beauty of it all. A woman with hair streaked silver approached her. She introduced herself as Nora Belling, a widow who had come to live among the Apache many years ago. Her smile was warm, her voice carrying the softness of someone who understood grief yet still chose gentleness. She took Elora's hands, examined her face with a tender gaze, then led her toward a shaded area where water waited in a clay bowl. Nora helped her wash, offered her fresh clothing fitted by skilled hands, and spoke to her as though she were someone worth caring for. Elora's throat tightened. She had not felt mothered in a long time, not since before her mother's illness, before the slow unraveling of Silas's spirit. She blinked back stinging tears, ashamed they rose so easily, but Nora brushed her cheek with a thumb and told her that tears were simply water helping the heart grow again. The words rooted themselves inside her. Over the next few hours, Elora learned small pieces of this new world. She watched children chase each other through patches of sunlight. She listened to the low hum of women sharing stories as they worked. She felt, for the first time in years, the sensation of belonging brushing against her, tentative yet unmistakable. When she glanced toward Talon, she found him watching from afar, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as if ensuring her ease without inserting himself where he wasn't needed. Little Crow, a boy no older than 11, approached shyly, holding a carved wooden figure. He offered it to her with both hands. Elora knelt, accepting it with a smile. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he stayed beside her, chattering in a mix of English and Apache. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the warmth behind them. Soon he was tugging her gently toward a group of children, who insisted she try a game involving stones and skillful flicks of the wrist. She laughed, truly laughed, as she failed miserably, her stones skittering off in every direction. Talon watched her with something like quiet pride softening his stern features. Later, when the sun began its slow descent, Elora joined Nora and the other women near a fire where they prepared a simple meal. She learned how to grind herbs with a stone bowl, how to thread strips of meat for drying, how to listen to the land through silence rather than noise. Nora told her that healing often came in small tasks, in humble moments that anchored the spirit. Elora believed her. As evening deepened, Talon approached her with a fresh bandage wrapped around his hand. She hadn't noticed the cut earlier, thin but deep across his palm. Without thinking, she reached for him, guiding him to sit. He hesitated, then yielded. She cleaned the wound carefully, her touch gentle, her breath slowing to match the quiet rhythm of his. The firelight painted warm color across his skin, and she saw the tiny shifts in his expression: surprise, gratitude, a flicker of something he quickly hid. Their hands lingered close after the bandage was set. The distance between them felt thinner than ever. She looked up into eyes that held storms and solace both, and something inside her leaned toward him without moving at all. But before she could sort the feeling, Nora called her name, pulling her back into the circle of women. Talon rose silently, stepping away with the same grace he brought to everything. Yet she felt the echo of his presence long after he moved. Night fell over the settlement with a softness that reminded her of quilts laid across sleeping children. Stars glimmered above, countless and clear. She lay inside a small dwelling Nora had prepared for her, wrapped in a blanket woven from wool dyed the color of desert grasses. Her body relaxed, but her thoughts stirred gently. She thought of Talon, of his steady silence, his quiet strength, the way he had watched over her since the moment the world had shifted at Jonas Pike's bar. She realized she trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in years. Perhaps ever. And that trust frightened her. No, not frightened, humbled her. Because trust was fragile, and her heart still carried cracks. But she also felt something stranger, something warmer, rising through her like light through water. It was not love. Love was too large a word, too soon. But it was the faint spark of possibility, the awareness of her own strength returning, a sense of standing not behind someone, not beneath someone, but beside them. Her eyes drifted shut. She breathed in the scent of smoke and wild sage. For the first time in years, she slept deeply. And she did not hear the distant hoofbeats gathering at the edge of the mesa, nor see the figure who watched the settlement from the shadows. Someone who knew her father, someone who would not leave her past buried. Dawn crept over the mesa with a muted glow, brushing the world in pale rose and soft gold. But the beauty of the morning carried an undertone of unease, like a violin string drawn just a shade too tight. Elora stepped from the small dwelling Nora had given her, the woven blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The air was cool and tender against her skin, yet something in it felt disturbed. The settlement was quiet, too quiet. The usual murmur of early activity, the women tending fires, the children chasing one another through the dust, had not begun. Even the wind seemed cautious. Talon stood near the edge of the settlement, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He was still but not calm. Every line of his body was pulled taut, like he was listening for something he hoped not to hear. Elora approached slowly, her steps soft on the packed earth. When he finally glanced toward her, his gaze held a depth that made her breath tighten, concern wrapped in a silence heavy enough to feel. He told her there were riders on the mesa at dawn, too far to see clearly, but close enough for him to sense their intent. She felt the words settle in her like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of fear outward. Her thoughts flew to Dustmere, to the shouts they had heard that first night. Talon didn't confirm her fear, but he didn't need to. The danger she hoped she had escaped was threading its way back into her world. Before Elora could speak, Little Crow came running, breathless, pointing toward the trail that wound up from the lowlands. Dust rose in thin spirals. Shadowed shapes moved behind it. 3 riders, their horses pushing hard, their bodies leaning forward with urgency that did not belong to peace. Elora felt her heart lurch. She knew the man in front by the way he held his reins, stiff, showy, and mean-spirited even in posture. Hank Rourke. A friend of her father's. One of the men who had laughed whenever Silas stumbled into the saloon, who had once told Elora she'd be pretty enough to marry if she learned to keep her mouth shut. If his presence was here, trouble was not far behind. Nora appeared at Elora's side, placing a steadying hand on her arm. Talon stepped forward, positioning himself between the settlement and the approaching riders with a quiet certainty that felt like a shield being raised. He did not reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. His stance alone spoke more clearly than any threat. The riders slowed as they neared, their horses snorting, hooves striking hard against the earth. Rourke's sneer looked carved into his face. He studied Talon with an expression that tried to be daring but wavered at the edges, as if he had not expected to find a man of such imposing calm standing in his way. His gaze flicked toward Elora then, something sharp and ugly lighting in his eyes. He called out that he had come to collect what belonged to Silas Mayfield. His voice carried the same arrogance as the men who believed their desires mattered more than anyone's dignity. Elora's breath caught. Her fingers curled around the blanket, gripping it as though it were a lifeline. Talon did not move, did not flinch, did not give the man's words any room to breathe. Instead he said, in a tone quiet as dusk yet firm as stone, that no person could be owned. Rourke scoffed, laughing the way men laughed when they tried to cover their fear with noise. He spat dust from his mouth and insisted she had been traded fair and square. The settlement fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elora stepped forward then, surprising herself as much as anyone. Her voice trembled at first, but strength rose through her, a strength she hadn't known she carried until that very moment. She told Rourke she did not belong to her father, had never belonged to anyone but herself, and that she had walked beside Talon by choice. Rourke's eyes narrowed, fury coiling in the tight lines of his face. He called her naive, claimed Talon had tricked her, dragged her out here like stolen property. His accusations spilled over, loud and simmering, but Elora held her ground, her heart pounding like hooves on hard dirt. Talon took one step forward. The movement was small, but it changed the air entirely. His voice dropped, so low it almost blended with the earth itself. He told Rourke to leave. Nothing more. Nothing less. Just a single word carried with a gravity that made even the horses shift uneasily. Rourke reached for his holster, but Talon moved faster, not with violence, but with certainty. His hand came to rest gently but firmly on Rourke's wrist. The message was unmistakable. No blood would be spilled here unless Rourke chose foolishness. The other riders shifted nervously, glancing between Talon's stillness and Rourke's rising anger. Marshal Briggs appeared then, emerging from the trail with dust staining his coat. Relief flickered through Elora's chest, though faint and uncertain. The marshal dismounted slowly, taking stock of the scene with tired eyes. He addressed Elora first, asking if she was safe, if she was here willingly. She answered yes. She felt the truth of it warm her from within. Briggs exhaled, long and weary. He warned Rourke he was on thin ice, that if he continued threatening an Apache settlement or a woman who had chosen her own path, he would face the law full force. The marshal's words weighed heavily. Even Rourke could see the line he was towing. With a final glare toward Elora, one that dripped venom and humiliation, he spat into the dust and turned his horse, riding off with the other men. But the danger didn't fade with their departure. Elora sensed that Rourke's retreat was not surrender. It was pause. Calculation. She felt a tremor of dread curl beneath her ribs. Talon watched the disappearing riders long after they vanished from sight, his jaw tight, his eyes storm-dark. When she stepped closer, he looked at her with a heaviness that was almost painful to see, an expression caught between protectiveness and remorse. He told her quietly that trouble would come again. Rourke was not the kind of man who took humiliation lightly. Men like him believed their will was law. Talon said it would be safer for her if she left the settlement, if she went somewhere Rourke could not twist her story, somewhere her past could not follow so easily. His words hit her like cold rain. She felt something inside her recoil, not from fear, but from the thought of being separated from the place that had shown her her own strength, from the people who had welcomed her, from the man who had changed the shape of her days without even meaning to. Yet Talon's eyes held a conviction she could not argue with. He believed leaving would protect her. He believed she could be safe elsewhere, far from the reach of the men who clung to her past like a weapon. Elora swallowed hard, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders. She met his gaze, her heart pounding with a clarity she had not expected. She did not want to leave. Not the settlement. Not the life she was beginning to build. And certainly not him. But before she could speak that truth aloud, before she could shape the words gathering like trembling birds in her throat, Talon stepped back, distancing himself in a single, subtle movement that felt sharper than any blow. She realized then, with a quiet ache settling low in her chest, that Talon feared something too. Not Rourke, not conflict, but the possibility that she might choose him for reasons tangled in gratitude or rescue rather than her own free heart. And just as she opened her mouth to stop him from slipping away, a distant echo cracked across the mesa. A rifle shot splitting the air, sharp and unmistakable, cutting off her words and freezing the world in its tracks. The rifle's echo rolled across the mesa like a crack in the sky, scattering every breath in the settlement. Elora dropped instinctively, dust rising around her in a trembling cloud, while Talon's body swept in front of hers with the immediacy of instinct sharpened by years of danger. His stance was solid, wide, braced against the earth, as though he could will the bullet's path to stop at the edge of his shadow. The silence afterward was too thin, too strained, stretched tight over the pounding of her heart. Another shot rang out, but this one hit the ground several yards behind them, sending shards of stone scattering. Talon's hand pressed to Alora's back, guiding her toward the shelter of a low earthen wall. Children were pulled into homes, Nora calling for calm even as fear trembled through her voice. Dust swirled, stirred by the frantic movement of horses on the far ridge. Alora recognized the rider silhouetted against the dying light. Hank Rourke, rifle raised, hatred coiling around him like smoke. Talon told her to stay low, but she shook her head, fear twisting into something fiercer. She would not hide while others shielded her. Yet Talon's eyes held such urgency, such unspoken pleading, that she crouched as he asked. Not from fear, but because she trusted him more than she trusted her own trembling resolve. Rourke shouted her name across the expanse, his voice fractured by rage, claiming she had been stolen, that he'd come to set things right. The words struck her like stones, each one a reminder of the world she had fled. Talon walked forward without a weapon, without armor, with only the gravity of a man who carried truth like a shield. Rourke aimed again, but his horse balked, jerking sideways as if the land itself refused to carry violence closer. Talon's voice rose then, not loud but steady, the voice of a man who chose restraint even when offered cruelty. He told Rourke she had chosen her path. He told him the trade had burned the moment Silas closed his hand around that bottle. He told him there would be no taking her anywhere. Rourke spat back that women didn't choose, that men decided the course of their futures. Alora stood then, heart hammering, and stepped past the wall. Talon reached for her arm on reflex, but she shook free, needing to speak, needing the world to hear the truth from her own mouth. The wind tugged at her hair as she called out that she was not property, not a prize to be traded, not a debt to be claimed. Her voice rang across the mesa like a bell struck clean. Rourke's face twisted, his rage unraveling. Before he could raise the rifle again, Marshal Briggs galloped into view, lassoing Rourke's arm with practiced precision. The rifle fell with a thud. The marshal wrestled him from the saddle, pinning him to the ground as Rourke cursed and writhed. When the dust finally settled, Briggs stood, breathing hard, and said Rourke would face charges for attempted murder and unlawful pursuit. His eyes found Alora, asking silently if she was unharmed. She nodded, though her knees trembled beneath her. The settlement exhaled, relief spreading in quiet waves. But Talon stood apart, his posture heavy with something deeper than danger, fear of another kind, quieter, more personal. When Alora approached, he looked away, jaw tight, shoulders drawn. She asked softly what weighed on him, but he said nothing. He only told her she should go somewhere safer now, somewhere untouched by the shadows of Dustmere. His voice trembled on the words, though he hid it well. He told her she deserved a peaceful life, not one threatened by the ghosts that followed him. The pain in her chest surprised her. She asked if he truly believed she would leave simply because trouble had reached them. She reminded him she had faced trouble all her life, often alone. The difference now was that she wasn't alone anymore. Talon closed his eyes briefly, as though her words struck too close. He told her she was young, kind, still healing, still discovering her place in the world. He said he could not be the one she tied herself to, not out of gratitude, not out of fear of being alone. His voice cracked on that last word, betraying the battle inside him. Alora stepped closer, until she could feel the warmth radiating from him. She lifted her hand slowly, giving him time to move away. He didn't. Her palm rested against his chest, the steady thrum of his heartbeat echoing into her skin. She told him she wasn't choosing him out of gratitude. She wasn't choosing safety or obligation or comfort. She was choosing truth, the truth that her heart felt steadier in his presence than it had felt anywhere else. Talon's breath shuddered. His hand rose hesitantly, as though he feared the world might split if he reached for her. But he touched her cheek, fingers brushing lightly, reverently, as if she were something fragile made of light. He told her he had loved her quietly since the first night by the fire, when she wrapped herself in his blanket, and held her sorrow with courage that humbled him. He told her he had tried to bury it, fearing she would mistake his love for ownership. But he could not hide it any more. Elora's eyes burned, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing words she had longed for without realizing it. She leaned into his touch, whispering that love was never meant to be a cage. It was meant to be a place to rest, to grow, to finally breathe. His forehead touched hers, their breaths mingling in the cool evening air as if exchanging pieces of spirit. The settlement quieted behind them, life resuming, but they heard none of it. The world felt suspended, hushed, holding its breath for them alone. Talon pulled her into his arms then, slowly, reverently, like asking a question he already knew the answer to. She melted into him, every trembling piece of her finding a home. And just when it seemed the moment might settle into peace, Nora hurried toward them with urgent eyes. A rider had arrived on the far ridge, alone, fast-moving, signaling with frantic sweeps of the arm. Someone was coming. Someone carrying news that would pull them into the next chapter, before the echo of their confession had even fully faded.